I walked into my husband's office holding homemade sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, thinking I was being the perfect wife. What I found instead shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. My sister, my own blood, was sitting on Martin's lap. They were kissing like I didn't exist, like our marriage was a joke, like 20 years of trust meant absolutely nothing. I should have screamed, should have thrown something, should have collapsed right there on his expensive carpet. But I didn't. I stood perfectly still, looked him dead in the eye, and said 5 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Then I turned around and walked out. He didn't follow me. He didn't call. He didn't even try to explain. That's when I knew this wasn't just an affair. This was something much, much worse. See, my husband wasn't just cheating, he was hunting. And I wasn't his first victim, I was number 16. Over the next 7 days, I did something he never saw coming. I didn't cry, I didn't beg, I didn't fall apart. I declared war. And when I was done, Martin Cole, the man who thought he could destroy me, lost everything. His money, his reputation, his freedom, his identity. 1 week after I caught them, he showed up at my door bankrupt and broken, begging me to stop. But I was just getting started. This is the story of how I took down a predator, saved 15 other women, and discovered that revenge isn't about anger, it's about justice. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why I never ever forgave him. My name is Eleanor Hayes. Most people call me Ellie, and at 58 years old, I thought I'd finally figured out what happiness looked like. I'm a librarian at the Maple Grove Public Library, a job I've held for over 30 years, and I'm known around our small Ohio town for my apple pies and my quiet, steady presence. 7 years ago, I lost my first husband, David, to cancer, and I thought that kind of love only came once in a lifetime. Then I met Martin Cole. That Tuesday started like any other. The library was quiet, just the soft rustle of turning pages and the hum of the old heating system. I'd made Martin's favorite roast beef sandwiches that morning, the kind with horseradish mayo and those pickles he likes from the deli on Main Street. I packed them in the wicker basket I'd gotten at the church bazaar, added a thermos of coffee, and decided to surprise him at his office. We'd been married 3 years, and I still liked doing little things like that, gestures that said I was thinking of him, that I cared. Martin was a financial advisor, one of the most respected in the county. When we met at a community fundraiser 4 years ago, I was still raw from losing David, still learning how to sleep in an empty bed. Martin was charming in that effortless way some men have, asking the right questions, listening like my answers actually mattered. He told me life was too short to wait, that we deserved happiness now, not someday. 6 months later, we were married in a small ceremony at the courthouse. My sister Jenna was my maid of honor. She'd cried during the vows, told me she was so happy I'd found love again. Looking back now, I wonder what those tears really meant. The drive to Martin's office took 15 minutes. His firm occupied the second floor of a renovated Victorian on Chestnut Street, all polished wood and brass fixtures that whispered success. I parked in the small lot behind the building and climbed the stairs, the wicker basket heavy on my arm. The receptionist's desk was empty. Carla always took lunch at noon, so I walked down the hallway myself, my shoes silent on the thick carpet. Martin's corner office had his name on the door in gold lettering, Martin Cole, CFP. I'd always been proud of him. I didn't knock. Why would I? I was his wife. I had a key. I turned the handle and pushed the door open, already smiling, already imagining his surprised face when he saw me. The smile died before it fully formed. My sister Jenna was sitting on Martin's lap. Her hands were in his hair. They were kissing, not a peck, not some innocent misunderstanding, but kissing the way people kiss when they've done it before, when they know exactly how the other person tastes. Martin's hands were on her waist, pulling her closer. I stood there in the doorway, the wicker basket still in my hand, and for a moment the world went absolutely silent. No traffic outside, no clock ticking, no breath in my lungs, just silence, and the image of my husband and my sister tangled together in that leather office chair. Jenna noticed me first. Her eyes went wide and she jerked back, her face flushing red. Martin turned his head slowly, like he'd known I was there all along and was just deciding when to acknowledge it. There was no panic in his expression, no guilt, just a cold, measured stare like he was calculating something. I should have screamed, should have thrown the basket at them, should have demanded answers right there. But I didn't. Instead, I stood perfectly still, met Martin's eyes, and spoke 5 words in a voice so calm it didn't even sound like mine. I hope it was worth it. Then I turned and walked out. I walked back down that quiet hallway, down the stairs across the parking lot to my car. I set the wicker basket on the passenger seat, those sandwiches I'd made with such care, the coffee I'd brewed just right. My hands weren't shaking, I wasn't crying. I felt strangely hollow, like someone had reached inside me and scooped out everything that mattered. Martin didn't follow me, didn't call my name, didn't come running down the stairs with excuses tumbling out of his mouth. That told me everything I needed to know. I drove home through streets I'd known my entire life, past the park, where David and I used to walk, past the church, where Martin and I got married, past the library, where I'd spent decades believing in order and fairness and the basic decency of people. When I got home, I sat in my kitchen, the one I'd painted yellow, because Martin said it was too dark, and I finally let myself feel it. Not sadness, not heartbreak. Rage. Pure, cold, clarifying rage. Because in that moment, standing in his office doorway, I'd seen something in Martin's face that terrified me more than the affair itself. He hadn't looked surprised. He hadn't looked sorry. He'd looked like a man who'd been caught doing something he'd planned all along. And what I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't discover until I started pulling at the threads of our life together, was that the security camera in Martin's office, the one with the blinking red light he thought was just for show, had recorded everything. Not just the kiss, not just Jenna on his lap, but me, standing there, watching, and the cold, calculating look in Martin's eyes as he counted the seconds until I disappeared. He thought I'd crumble, thought I'd cry and forgive and forget the way good wives were supposed to. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, Jenna's hands in his hair, Martin's face when he finally looked at me, that cold, empty stare. But somewhere around 3 a.m, sitting at my kitchen table with a cold cup of tea I'd forgotten to drink, something shifted inside me. The hurt was still there, a dull ache behind my ribs, but it was being crowded out by something else. Suspicion. I kept replaying moments from our marriage, little things I'd dismissed or explained away. Martin had always insisted on handling our finances. "You've got enough to worry about at the library, sweetheart," he'd say, kissing my forehead like I was a child who couldn't be trusted with checkbooks. When my mother died 2 years ago and left me her small estate, Martin had asked detailed questions about the inheritance, how much, where it was held, whether there were any trusts or secondary beneficiaries. At the time, I thought he was being helpful, making sure everything was properly managed. Now those questions felt different, pointed, predatory. And then there was his office. In 3 years of marriage, I'd only been there a handful of times and never alone. He always met me in the lobby, walked me back out to my car, said he liked keeping work and home separate, that his office was boring anyway, nothing but filing cabinets and financial reports. I'd believed him because I had no reason not to, because I'd thought we were building a life together, not because he was hiding something. By the time dawn started creeping through the kitchen windows, I wasn't heartbroken anymore. I was angry, and I was going to find out why. I started in Martin's home office, a small room off the living room, where he kept duplicate files in his laptop. I photographed everything: bank statements, investment portfolios, insurance policies, the deed to our house. I didn't know what I was looking for yet, but I knew I needed evidence of something. My phone's camera roll filled up quickly, page after page of numbers and legal language I didn't fully understand, but would learn to. Then I moved to the hall closet where we kept old photo albums and memory boxes. I pulled down the white leather album from our wedding, expecting nothing, just being thorough. The photos were exactly as I remembered me in my simple cream dress, Martin in his navy suit, Jenna dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. But when I flipped to the back of the album, something slipped out from behind the last page. A photograph smaller than the others, printed on different paper. It showed Martin at what looked like a charity gala or fundraiser. He was younger, maybe early 40s, standing next to an elegant elderly woman in pearls and a black evening gown. They weren't touching, but they stood close, comfortable. The photo was dated in the bottom corner 20 years ago, a full 16 years before Martin and I even met. I turned it over, and my heart stopped. In Martin's handwriting, small and neat, "Next E. Hayes." My hands started shaking, then the first physical reaction I'd had since walking out of his office. E. Hayes, Eleanor Hayes, me. This photo was taken 2 decades ago, and my name was already on it. Next, like I was an item on a shopping list. Like I was a goal to be achieved. I sat on the floor of the hallway, that photograph in my trembling hands, and tried to make sense of it. How could Martin have targeted me 20 years ago? We met 4 years ago at a fundraiser, random, coincidental or so, I'd thought. But if my name was written on a photo from 1994, then nothing about our meeting was random. He'd been planning this, watching me, waiting. But why? What did I have that was worth a 20-year plan? I thought about Miriam Blake, my friend from college. We'd lost touch over the years, the way people do. But I knew she'd become a lawyer. More specifically, a lawyer who specialized in financial crimes. I'd seen an article about her in the newspaper a few years back, something about prosecuting white-collar fraud. I found her firm's number online and left a voicemail, keeping my voice steady, even though my hands were still shaking. She called back within an hour. "Ellie Hayes," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "It's been forever. What's going on?" "I need a lawyer," I said. "But not for a divorce." There was a pause. "What do you need, Ellie?" I looked down at the photograph still clutched in my hand at my name, written in Martin's careful script. "I don't want a divorce lawyer, Miriam. I want a prosecutor." We agreed to meet the next day. After I hung up, I did 3 things I'd never done before in my marriage. I changed every password on every account I had access to. I transferred half the money from our joint savings account into a new account Martin didn't know about. And I started a folder on my laptop labeled Evidence. Because the wedding photo wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing I'd been a business plan all along. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold hours ago, staring at the yellow walls I'd painted because Martin said the original color was too depressing. The rage from earlier had settled into something else, something quieter, but infinitely more dangerous. Clarity. I kept replaying moments from our marriage scenes I'd dismissed or explained away. Martin's insistence on handling all our finances, even though I'd managed my own money perfectly well for decades. The way he'd ask seemingly casual questions about my mother's estate when she passed questions that felt a little too detailed, a little too interested. How he always found reasons for me not to visit his office unannounced. "The clients need privacy, sweetheart," he'd say. "You understand?" I'd understood all right. I'd understood exactly what he wanted me to understand. But now, sitting in the dark kitchen at 3 in the morning, I understood something else entirely. This wasn't just about an affair. Affairs were messy, emotional, impulsive. What I'd seen in Martin's face when he looked at me in that doorway wasn't guilt or panic. It was calculation. Like he'd been waiting for this moment, measuring it, deciding how to handle it. By the time dawn broke, I wasn't heartbroken anymore. I was suspicious. I started in Martin's home office, the room he'd claimed as his the day we moved in together. He kept it locked most of the time, said it was because of sensitive client information. I'd never questioned it. Why would I? I trusted him. But I had a key now, found it in the kitchen junk drawer where he thought I'd never look, and I used it. Inside, I photographed everything. Bank statements showing accounts I'd never seen before. Insurance policies with beneficiaries I didn't recognize. Property deeds for investments he'd never mentioned. My hands stayed steady as I worked my phone, clicking picture after picture. I didn't know what I was looking for yet, but I knew I'd recognize it when I found it. The marriage certificate was in the filing cabinet, tucked in a folder marked Personal Documents. I pulled it out, studied Martin's signature, that confident scrawl I'd once found attractive. Behind it was our wedding album, the white leather one Jenna had given us as a gift. I almost put it back. Almost. But something made me flip through it one more time. That's when I found the photograph. It was tucked behind one of our wedding pictures loose, like someone had slipped it in and forgotten about it. The image showed Martin at what looked like an upscale charity event, black tie affair champagne glasses and crystal chandeliers in the background. He was younger, maybe 20 years younger, standing next to an elegant elderly woman in pearls and a navy dress. They were both smiling at the camera. Nothing unusual about that. Plenty of people took photos at charity galas. But when I turned it over, my heart stopped. On the back, in Martin's distinctive handwriting, were 3 words and a name: Next E. Hayes. E. Hayes. Eleanor Hayes. Me. The photograph was dated 20 years ago. 2 decades before I'd ever met Martin Cole at that community fundraiser. 2 decades before I'd been a widow looking for a second chance at happiness. My hands started shaking, then the first physical reaction I'd had since walking out of his office. I sat down hard on the office chair, the photograph trembling in my grip. He'd been planning this. For how long? Since before David died. Since before I even knew Martin existed. I wasn't a wife. I wasn't even a romantic conquest. I was a target. The timeline didn't make sense yet. I didn't know how Martin could have known about me 20 years ago, didn't know what connected me to that elegant woman in pearls, didn't know what next meant or what came before me. But the intent was crystal clear. Martin Cole had married me on purpose, with premeditation, with a plan that stretched back 2 decades. This wasn't betrayal. This was something else entirely, something cold and calculated and terrifying. I took a picture of the photograph with my phone front and back, then slipped it into my purse. Evidence. I'd need evidence for whatever came next. Then I called Miriam Blake. Miriam and I had been roommates in college back when the world was simpler, and our biggest concern was passing organic chemistry. She'd gone on to law school, specialized in financial crimes, made a name for herself prosecuting white-collar criminals. We'd drifted apart over the years, the way people do, but I still had her number in my old address book, still remembered her fierce intelligence and her absolute intolerance for injustice. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice foggy with sleep. "Hello. Miriam, it's Ellie Hayes. Eleanor, we went to college together." There was a pause, then recognition. "Ellie, my God, it's been 15 years. Are you okay? It's 5 in the morning. I need a lawyer." I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But not a divorce lawyer. I need someone who knows financial crimes. I need a prosecutor." Another pause, longer this time. When Miriam spoke again, her voice was sharp alert. "What happened?" "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "But I'm going to find out. Can you meet me tomorrow?" "I'll clear my schedule," she said. "Send me your address." After we hung up, I sat there for a long moment, phone in my hand, wedding photo in my lap. Then I did something Martin never expected me to do. I fought back. I changed every password I had. Email, banking, social media, everything. I logged into our joint checking account and transferred exactly half the balance to a new account I opened in my name only. Not to steal, not to punish, but to protect. Whatever Martin was planning, he wasn't going to leave me penniless while he did it. Then I started building my paper trail. Copies of everything uploaded to a cloud storage account Martin didn't know existed, backed up on a thumb drive I hid in a tampon box under the bathroom sink. The sun was fully up by the time I finished. I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Same face, same gray-streaked hair, same quiet librarian who baked apple pies and never made waves. But something in my eyes had changed. I didn't know what I was fighting yet, didn't know the full scope of what Martin had done or why he'd done it. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The wedding photo wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing I'd been a business plan all along. I spent the next day preparing for my meeting with Miriam, organizing documents and timelines, trying to build a coherent picture from fragments that didn't quite fit together. But when the doorbell rang that evening, it wasn't Miriam standing on my porch. It was Jenna. My sister looked tired. Her makeup smudged her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. For a moment, I thought she'd come to apologize, to explain, to beg for forgiveness. I was already bracing myself for tears and excuses. But when I opened the door, what I got instead was anger. "We need to talk," Jenna said, pushing past me into the house without waiting for an invitation. She stood in my living room, arms crossed, jaw set, in that defiant way she'd had since we were kids. "You don't get to play the victim here, Ellie." I closed the door slowly, my hand still on the knob. "Excuse me." "You heard me." Her voice was sharp, brittle. "You act like you're so hurt, so betrayed, but where were you when I needed you? When Mom was dying and the bills kept coming and I couldn't afford to keep the heat on in January." The accusation hit me like a slap. "Jenna, I sent you money. I was at the funeral. I called you every week." "You sent a check," she spat back. "You showed up for 2 days and went back to your perfect little life with your perfect new husband. You have no idea what it was like drowning in $80,000 of medical debt, watching collection agencies circle like vultures. I was alone, Ellie. Completely alone." I wanted to argue, to list every way I'd tried to help, every phone call she'd cut short, every offer of support she'd waved away. But something in her voice stopped me. Not the anger, but the rehearsed quality of it, like she was reciting lines she'd practiced. "Martin helped me," Jenna continued, her voice rising. "He paid off everything, every single bill. He saved me when my own sister couldn't be bothered. So don't you dare stand there and judge me for being grateful, for caring about someone who actually showed up when it mattered." I studied her face, looking for the sister I'd grown up with, the girl who'd shared my bedroom, and my secrets and my mother's apple pie recipe. But all I saw was someone performing, hitting her marks, delivering her lines with just enough conviction to be believable. "Is that what he told you to say?" I asked quietly. Jenna's eyes flickered, just for a second. "What?" "Martin, is that what he told you to say to me?" "Nobody told me anything," she said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "I'm just telling you the truth." "The truth," I repeated. "That I abandoned you, that Martin saved you, that I have no right to be upset about finding my husband with my sister. That's not what I—" She stopped, shaking her head. "You're twisting my words." "Am I—" Her phone buzzed then, loud in the tense silence between us. It was sitting on the coffee table where she'd tossed it when she came in. Jenna lunged for it, but her hand was shaking, and the phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the glass surface, landing face up. I saw the notification before she could grab it. "Stick to the script. She'll believe you. M." Time seemed to stop. I stared at those words, at that single letter signature that could only mean one person. Jenna snatched the phone up, her face going pale, and suddenly she was fumbling for her purse, stammering excuses that made no sense. "I have to go. I shouldn't have come. This was a mistake." She was at the door before I could respond, practically running down the porch steps to her car. I didn't chase her, didn't call after her. I just stood there, my own phone already in my hand, the photo I'd managed to snap of her screen still glowing on my display. After her taillights disappeared down the street, I sat on the couch in the gathering darkness and let myself process what I'd just witnessed. My sister hadn't come here on her own. She'd been sent. Every word, every accusation, every guilt trip had been scripted by Martin, designed to make me doubt myself, to make me feel like I deserved what he'd done. But why? Why manipulate Jenna? Why stage this elaborate performance? The answer came to me slowly, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Martin didn't just want an affair. He wanted me off balance, questioning myself, too consumed with family drama to look too closely at anything else. He wanted me distracted. I turned on the lamp and pulled out the folder I'd been compiling, the one I was supposed to show Miriam tomorrow. Inside were copies of my mother's estate documents, the ones Martin had so generously offered to handle when she died. I'd been grateful at the time, too grief-stricken to deal with paperwork and probate and all the bureaucratic machinery of death. Now I looked at them with fresh eyes. There were payments to accounts I didn't recognize, transactions that made no sense. A life insurance policy I'd never known Mom had taken out just 6 months before she died. And there in the beneficiary section was my name as primary and Martin Cole as contingent beneficiary. If something happened to me, Martin would get everything. My mother had died of complications from pneumonia, sudden and unexpected. She'd been in the hospital recovering well, and then she'd taken a turn. The doctor said these things happened sometimes, that older patients were fragile, that there was nothing anyone could have done. But Martin had been there. He'd visited her in the hospital, brought her flowers, sat with her when I couldn't get away from work. Everyone had commented on what a devoted son-in-law he was, how lucky I was to have found such a caring man. I looked at the insurance policy again, at the date it was signed at Martin's name in that beneficiary line. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady as I added the photo of Jenna's text message to my evidence folder, as I highlighted the suspicious transactions in Mom's estate records, as I made notes for Miriam about timelines and patterns and questions that needed answers. My sister left my house that night thinking she'd completed her assignment, thinking she'd successfully distracted me or made me doubt myself. But what she didn't know, what Martin didn't know, was that her phone had showed me the truth. Jenna wasn't his lover. She was his actress playing a role in whatever sick game he was running. And I was done being part of the audience. The cafe Miriam chose was 20 miles outside of town, the kind of place where nobody from Maple Grove would accidentally run into us. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth, with her back to the wall, a leather portfolio open in front of her. When she looked up and saw me, something flickered across her face that I couldn't quite read. Recognition, yes, but something deeper. Something that looked almost like relief. We ordered coffee, we didn't drink, and made small talk. We didn't mean for exactly 3 minutes. Then I slid my folder across the table and watched Miriam's expression change as she flipped through the pages. The wedding photo with the mystery woman and Next E. Hayes scrawled on the back, the screenshot of Jenna's text message, my mother's estate documents with their suspicious transactions, the life insurance policy naming Martin as contingent beneficiary. Miriam's face grew darker with each page, her jaw tightening until I could see the muscle working beneath her skin. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been rage. "Ellie," she said, and her voice was rough. "I need to tell you something before we go any further. Something I should have told you on the phone, but I was afraid you'd hang up if you knew." My stomach dropped. "What is it?" She closed the folder carefully, her hands trembling slightly. 8 years ago, I represented my older sister Caroline in a case against Martin Cole. She'd hired him as her financial advisor after her husband died, trusted him with her retirement fund about $400,000. Within 18 months, it was gone. Martin claimed bad investments, market volatility, things beyond his control, but Caroline knew better. She knew he'd stolen it. I felt cold all over. "What happened? We had evidence." Miriam continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Bank transfers, forged signatures, the whole pattern. But Martin had better lawyers who knew how to bury evidence and intimidate witnesses. The case fell apart. Caroline lost everything, not just the money, but the legal fees, her home, her dignity. 6 months after we lost the case, she took a bottle of sleeping pills and never woke up." The words hung in the air between us. I thought about my mother, about the sudden complications that had taken her, about Martin sitting beside her hospital bed with flowers and that concerned smile. "Miriam, I'm so sorry." She shook her head sharply. "Don't be sorry. Be angry, because I've been waiting 8 years for someone brave enough to take him down, someone he couldn't intimidate or pay off or silence. You're that person, Ellie. I know you are." "How can you be sure?" "Because you're still here," she said simply. "You're sitting across from me with evidence instead of crying at home with excuses. That's how I know." She made a phone call right there in the booth, and within an hour, a man named Caleb Rios joined us. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly rumpled look of someone who spent more time with spreadsheets than people. Miriam introduced him as the best forensic accountant in the state, someone who'd helped her put away 3 Ponzi schemers and a county treasurer who'd embezzled $2 million from the school system. "Show him everything," Miriam said. So I did. Caleb worked fast, his fingers flying over his laptop keyboard as he pulled up databases and cross-referenced information I didn't even know existed. He asked questions in a quiet, methodical voice, taking notes in a spiral notebook that quickly filled with diagrams and numbers and names. It took him 3 days to find the pattern. 3 days of phone calls and encrypted emails and documents couriered to Miriam's office in manila envelopes marked confidential. When he finally asked us to meet him again, his face was grim. "I found 15 life insurance policies," he said without preamble. 15 different women, all widows or divorcees, all in vulnerable financial positions when they met Martin Cole. Each policy lists Martin as either the primary beneficiary or contingent beneficiary. The death benefits range from $200,000 to over $1 million. My hands felt numb. 15. "You're the 16th, Caleb said, and his voice was gentle but unyielding. "I found the application in Martin's office files. He took out a policy on you 18 months ago, $500,000 with himself as primary beneficiary." The room tilted slightly. 18 months ago. Long before I'd found him with Jenna. Long before I'd discovered the photograph or suspected anything was wrong. How many of these women are still alive? I heard myself ask. Caleb glanced at Miriam, then back at me. 9. 6 are deceased. The causes of death vary. Heart attacks, accidents, sudden illness. Nothing that raised red flags at the time. But now it's a pattern, he said. This isn't fraud, Ellie. This is something worse. Miriam reached across the table and opened a folder I hadn't noticed before. Inside were photographs, dozens of them faces of women I didn't know. Some were professional headshots, the kind you'd use for a LinkedIn profile. Some were cropped from wedding photos or family gatherings. And some were obituaries, black and white newsprint images, with dates of death printed beneath kind, trusting faces. "I've been collecting these for years," Miriam said softly. "Every woman I could connect to Martin, every case that got dismissed or settled quietly, every restraining order that went nowhere because he was too charming or too connected or too careful. This is his wall of victims, Ellie. These women trusted him. Some of them loved him. And he erased them one by one, turning their lives into profit margins." She pulled out one photograph and set it in front of me. A woman in her 50s with Miriam's same dark eyes and sharp cheekbones, smiling at the camera like she had no idea what was coming. "That's Caroline," Miriam said. "My sister. Don't let him add you to this wall." I looked at the faces staring back at me from that folder, at the pattern Caleb had uncovered, at the cold arithmetic of Martin's system. 15 women, 16 including me. Some still alive, some already gone, all of us marked as targets in whatever twisted game he was playing. I thought about my mother's sudden decline in that hospital bed, about the life insurance policy I'd never known existed, about Martin's helpful presence through all of it. And I made a vow sitting there in Miriam's office with the evidence spread out before us like a map of horror. I wouldn't just escape. I wouldn't just divorce him or expose him or ruin his reputation. I would burn his empire to the ground and make sure every woman's name he'd ever targeted was cleared, every family he'd destroyed was vindicated, every lie he'd ever told was exposed. Because those weren't just insurance policies Caleb had found. They were 15 women, 15 life insurance policies, 15 reasons to make sure I didn't see my next birthday. Miriam didn't waste time. The day after Caleb presented his findings, she started making calls, quiet conversations with women whose names had appeared in Martin's files, women who'd lost money or trust or both. Some hung up, some cried. But 3 of them said yes, they'd meet with me, they'd listen, they'd consider helping bring down the man who'd taken so much from all of us. We gathered at Ruth Morrison's house on a gray Thursday afternoon. Ruth answered the door herself, refusing the assistance of the home health aide, who hovered nervously in the background. She was 70, rail thin from the cancer eating through her, but her handshake was firm and her eyes were clear. Her living room smelled like lavender and old books, the kind of space that had seen decades of life and was now witnessing its owner's final chapter. Louise Harper arrived next, a tall woman with silver hair cut in a no-nonsense bob and the commanding presence of someone who'd spent 40 years managing teenagers. She'd been principal at Maple Grove High until her retirement 5 years ago, and I recognized her immediately, though we'd never formally met. She carried a leather satchel that looked heavy with documents. Janet Reeves was the last to arrive, moving slowly but deliberately, her cane tapping against Ruth's hardwood floors. She'd been a family court judge for 30 years before retiring, and even now in casual clothes, she carried an air of authority that made you want to sit up straighter. These weren't victims. They were warriors. And as we settled into Ruth's living room, I realized I was in the presence of women who'd seen too much and stayed silent too long, who were finally ready to speak. Ruth started. Her voice was soft but steady as she told us about meeting Martin 6 years ago after her husband passed. Martin had been recommended by her bank, so polished and professional, promising to help her stretch her pension and Social Security into a comfortable retirement. Within 18 months, $400,000 was gone. Market fluctuations, he'd said. Bad timing. Nothing he could have predicted. But I was an insurance investigator for 35 years, Ruth said. I knew fraud when I saw it. The problem was proving it. She reached beneath the cushion of her chair and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind reporters used to use before smartphones. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it. I recorded our last meeting, she said. I'd already started to suspect and I wanted evidence. But what he said that day, it wasn't about money anymore. She pressed play. Martin's voice filled the room, younger, sounding more casual than I'd ever heard it. There was small talk first, pleasantries about the weather, and then his voice shifted, became almost playful. Ruth, can I ask you something? Hypothetically, of course. You used to investigate insurance claims, right? Accidental deaths, that sort of thing. Ruth's recorded voice cautious. Yes, that was part of my job. So hypothetically, if someone wanted to make a death look accidental, what would you look for? What mistakes do people make? There was a pause on the recording, and I could imagine Ruth's face, the realization dawning, but her voice stayed professional. That's a strange question, Martin. Just morbid curiosity, he said, laughing. I read too many mystery novels. But seriously, how would you do it? Medication interactions, a fall down the stairs. The recording continued for another 3 minutes, Martin pressing Ruth, deflecting, and by the end of it, my hands were shaking. He'd walked her through scenarios like he was planning a vacation, casual and thorough and absolutely chilling. I stopped answering his calls after that, Ruth said, clicking off the recorder. But I kept the tape. I knew someday it might matter. I just didn't know I'd be dying before I got to use it. You're not dying yet, Miriam said firmly, and this recording is gold. Louise spoke next, opening her satchel and pulling out printouts. She'd used her access to education databases to check Martin's credentials, the degrees he claimed, the certifications that decorated his office walls. 2 of them were from institutions that had closed decades ago. One was from a program that never existed. He's not a certified financial planner, Louise said flatly. The certificate in his office is a forgery. I verified it with the CFP board. Martin Cole is not and has never been certified. Everything he's built is on a foundation of lies. Janet, the retired judge, listened to everything with her hands folded in her lap. When we finished, she looked at each of us in turn. Here's what we're going to do, she said, and her voice carried the weight of decades, making decisions that changed lives. Ellie, you're going to file an emergency protective order tomorrow morning. I'll walk you through every word. We'll also file a motion to freeze all jointly held assets pending investigation. It won't stop him completely, but it'll slow him down. She turned to Louise. You're going to submit an anonymous tip to the Ohio Division of Financial Institutions about the falsified credentials. Make it detailed. Make it credible. Then to Miriam and Caleb. Forward everything about those insurance policies to the state insurance commissioner. Not as a formal complaint, yet just a concerned citizen notification. Let them start asking questions. Within 48 hours, we'd executed every piece of Janet's plan. I stood in the county courthouse and filed the protective order, my signature steady on every page. Louise's anonymous tip landed on the desk of a licensing investigator who'd been looking for a reason to examine Martin's practice. Caleb's carefully worded email to the insurance commissioner sparked an audit that would take weeks to complete, but had already frozen Martin's ability to collect on any policies. Martin's joint accounts were flagged. His credentials were under review. His insurance schemes were being investigated. He couldn't access our money. He couldn't operate freely. He didn't know yet who had hit him or how many fronts this war was being fought on. But he was starting to bleed. I thought about that photograph from 20 years ago, about the elegant woman in pearls and the words "Next E," next, Hayes on the back. I thought about my mother's sudden death, and Jenna's scripted confrontation, and Ruth's recording of Martin casually discussing murder techniques. And I realized something that made me smile for the first time in weeks. When 5 women stop being polite and start being strategic, even a predator becomes prey. The legal paperwork was filed, the investigations were beginning, but I couldn't stop thinking about my mother. The life insurance policy with Martin's name on it haunted me, along with the memory of how quickly she'd declined in those final weeks. Mom had been recovering well from pneumonia, the doctors optimistic, and then everything had gone wrong so fast. At the time, I'd accepted it as one of those tragic turns that happen with elderly patients. Now, with everything I knew about Martin, I couldn't accept anything at face value anymore. I drove to Riverside Memorial Hospital on a Monday morning, the same building where my mother had spent her last days 3 years ago. The medical records department was in the basement, a fluorescent-lit maze of filing cabinets and computer terminals. The clerk behind the desk looked up from her computer screen with the weary expression of someone who'd answered the same questions 1,000 times. "I need to request my mother's medical records," I said. "She passed away here 3 years ago. I'm her next of kin." Under HIPAA regulations, I had the legal right to access everything. The clerk handed me forms to fill out, explained the processing fee, told me it would take about a week. I paid with a check and left with a receipt and a sick feeling in my stomach that wouldn't go away. The records arrived in a thick manila envelope 7 days later. I spread them across my dining table, page after page of medical terminology and nursing notes and doctor's observations. My mother had been admitted for pneumonia on March 15th. The first week showed steady improvement. Her oxygen levels were stabilizing. Her fever had broken. The notes from Dr. Chen were optimistic, talking about discharge within days. Then something changed. March 22nd, patient experiencing confusion and disorientation. March 24th, irregular heartbeat, noted cardiology consult requested. March 26th, patient unresponsive, transferred to ICU. March 27th, cardiac arrest, resuscitation, unsuccessful time of death, recorded as 11:47 p.m. 10 days from improvement to death. 10 days of cascading complications that the doctors had chalked up to her age, her weakened immune system, the unpredictability of elderly patients recovering from serious illness. But tucked in the back of the file was something I hadn't expected: the visitor log. Hospital policy required all visitors to sign in and out a security measure that had seemed pointless at the time, but now felt like a gift from a past I hadn't known to be grateful for. I ran my finger down the entries for my mother's room. My name appeared multiple times along with Jenna's, a few church friends, the pastor, and then 3 times a name that made my blood run cold. Martin Cole, March 20th. March 23rd, March 26th. My hands started shaking. Martin and I had only been dating for 2 months when my mother was hospitalized. I hadn't introduced them yet. Mom had been protective, asking questions about him that I'd found intrusive at the time. Where did he come from? What happened to his previous clients? Why was he so interested in my financial situation? I'd brushed off her concerns as motherly overprotection, told her she'd meet him when she was feeling better. But Martin had met her anyway, 3 times, and I'd never known. I found the name of the head nurse from that ward through the hospital directory, tracked her down through social media. Patricia Kowalski had retired 18 months ago and was living in Florida, but she answered my call on the second ring. "Mrs. Kowalski, my name is Eleanor Hayes. My mother, Margaret Hayes, was a patient on your ward 3 years ago. I'm hoping you might remember her." There was a pause, then a warm voice. "Oh yes, I remember Margaret. Such a sweet lady. I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you. I'm calling because I'm reviewing her medical records, and I noticed she had a visitor I didn't know about, a man named Martin Cole. He signed in 3 times. "The handsome gentleman," Patricia said immediately. "Oh yes, I remember him. He was so devoted, so concerned about Margaret's care. He asked very detailed questions about her medications, her dosage schedules when the nurses did their rounds. I remember thinking what a wonderful son-in-law you were going to have, how lucky you were to find someone so caring." My throat felt tight. "What kind of questions exactly?" Oh, medical things. What she was taking, how often, whether the dosages had been adjusted. He said he wanted to make sure everything was being done properly, that no mistakes were being made. I thought it was sweet that he was being so attentive. After I hung up, I sat at my dining table staring at those visitor log entries and tried to breathe through the rage and grief crushing my chest. Martin hadn't been attentive. He'd been gathering intelligence, learning the layout, the medication schedule, the gaps in supervision. Miriam brought in a forensic toxicologist, a woman named Dr. Patel, who specialized in medication-related deaths. She reviewed the medical records with clinical detachment, making notes in a leather journal. "These symptoms, Doctor," Patel said, tapping the pages from March 24th onward. "Arrhythmia, confusion, sudden cardiac arrest. They're consistent with digoxin toxicity. Your mother was on digoxin for a pre-existing heart condition. If someone with access to her medication gradually increased the dose, the effects would look exactly like this. Complications from pneumonia, natural decline. Nothing that would raise immediate red flags." "Can you prove it?" I asked. She shook her head slowly. "Not without tissue samples, and you said she was cremated. But the pattern is there. 3 visits from Martin Cole, 3 sudden declines immediately following. The timing is damning even if the physical evidence is gone." I looked at the calendar I'd made, marking out the dates of Martin's visits against my mother's deterioration. He'd killed her. I knew it with a certainty that went beyond proof or evidence. He'd killed her because she'd asked too many questions, because she'd been protective of me, because she was the one person who might have seen through him before it was too late. My mother didn't die from cancer complications. She died because she tried to protect me from him, and I was going to make sure everyone knew it. I'd been expecting Martin to show up eventually, but when he finally did, it still caught me off guard. It was late on a Thursday evening, nearly 10 o'clock, and I was in the kitchen reviewing documents with Miriam when I heard his car pull into the driveway. The engine cut off, a door slammed, and then his fist was pounding on my front door. Miriam tensed, reaching for her phone, but I shook my head. I'd been preparing for this moment. I walked to the door and opened it, keeping the chain lock engaged. Martin looked nothing like the polished financial advisor who'd swept me off my feet 4 years ago. His hair was uncombed, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. He'd been drinking. I could smell it from 3 feet away. "Ellie, please," he said, and his voice cracked. "Please let me explain. I love you. I need you to understand I was going to stop. You changed me. Everything changed when I met you." For just a moment, hearing the raw emotion in his voice, I felt something shift inside me. This was the man I'd married, the man who'd held me when I cried about David, who'd promised me we'd grow old together. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that somewhere beneath all the lies there was something real. Then I remembered the photograph with "Next E. Hayes" written on the back. I remembered 15 insurance policies and 6 dead women. I remembered my mother's visitor log and Martin's careful questions about medication schedules. I kept my voice perfectly steady. "The camera in your office is still recording. Say it again." Martin's face went blank, all that desperate emotion draining away like water down a sink. His eyes shifted, calculating, and I saw him realize what I'd just told him. The security camera he thought was just for show had been recording everything. Our confrontation in his office, his affair with Jenna, evidence he couldn't explain away. "You've been playing me," he said, and now his voice was flat cold. "No," I said. "I've been documenting you. There's a difference." Rage flickered behind his eyes, something dark and ugly that he'd kept hidden throughout our marriage. He took a step toward the door, and I saw his hand clench into a fist. Miriam moved into view behind me, her phone raised. "The FBI is parked across the street," I said calmly. "Wave hello." Martin's head whipped around. Sure enough, a dark sedan sat at the curb, 2 figures visible in the front seat. They weren't making any move to intervene, but their presence was clear. They were watching, waiting. Martin backed away from the door, his face twisted with an emotion I couldn't read. Then he turned and walked to his car, his movements jerky and uncontrolled. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine and driving away. I watched his taillights disappear and realized my hands were shaking. "Are you okay?" Miriam asked. "I will be," I said, "once he's in prison." The story broke 2 days later on the local news. The anchor's voice was careful, legally vetted, but the implications were clear. A financial advisor in Maple Grove was under investigation for fraud and potential elder abuse. They didn't name Martin, but they didn't have to. In a town of 8,000 people, everyone knew exactly who they were talking about. I watched Martin's world collapse in real time. His office phone went straight to voicemail. Clients started pulling their accounts, demanding audits, hiring their own lawyers. The parking lot at his building, usually full, sat empty. Someone spray-painted "fraud" across his office window, and it stayed there for 3 days before anyone bothered to clean it off. I gave no interviews, made no public statements. I didn't need to. The evidence was doing the talking for me. Then Evelyn Sharp appeared on national television, and everything changed. I was folding laundry when Miriam called, her voice urgent. "Turn on Channel 7, now." I grabbed the remote and switched on the TV. There, sitting across from a morning news anchor, was an elegant elderly woman in her 80s, wearing pearls and a navy dress. I recognized her immediately from the photograph I'd found behind my wedding picture. 20 years ago, Evelyn Sharp said, looking directly into the camera with steel in her eyes, a man calling himself Martin Cole convinced me to invest $300,000 in what he claimed was a secure retirement fund. Within 18 months, that money was gone. I never pursued criminal charges because I was ashamed. I thought I'd been foolish, gullible. But I'm 82 years old now, and I'm not ashamed anymore. I'm angry. The anchor leaned forward. "What made you decide to come forward now?" "Because I've been watching the news from Ohio," Evelyn said. "And I recognize the pattern. Martin Cole is not this man's real name. I hired investigators 20 years ago, the best money could buy, and they couldn't find any record of him existing before 1995. So I'm offering $500,000 to anyone who can prove Martin Cole's real identity and help bring him to justice. Because women like me, like Eleanor Hayes, like all his other victims, we deserve the truth." My phone started ringing before the interview even ended. Tips, questions, reporters wanting statements. But one message stood out, a private email with just 3 words: "Let's talk, Evelyn." We met the next afternoon at a restaurant 30 miles outside town. Evelyn Sharp was smaller in person, but no less commanding, her gaze sharp and assessing, as I slid into the booth across from her. "You're braver than I was," she said without preamble. "I let him disappear. You're making sure he can't." "He killed my mother," I said. "I don't have a choice." "We always have a choice," Evelyn said. She pushed a thick folder across the table. "I've been collecting information on Martin Cole for 20 years. Everything my investigators found, every lead they chased, every dead end and false identity. It's yours now." I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of documents, photographs, newspaper clippings, spanning 2 decades. And on top, a birth certificate for someone named Michael Strauss. "The man you married wasn't just a liar," Evelyn said softly. "He was a ghost with a Social Security number." The birth certificate in Evelyn's folder was for a boy named Michael Strauss, born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1983. The name meant nothing to me at first, just another piece of the puzzle that was slowly coming together. But when I showed it to Miriam, her face went pale. "Strauss," she said quietly. "I know that name." She pulled up news archives on her laptop, typing with quick, precise movements. What appeared on the screen was a series of headlines from the late 1990s. "Ponzi scheme defrauds hundreds." "Financial advisor sentenced to 25 years. Strauss dies in prison, apparent suicide." Richard Strauss had run one of the biggest financial fraud operations Ohio had seen in decades. Over the course of 10 years, he'd convinced hundreds of retirees to invest in what he called guaranteed return portfolios. The money went into his pocket, into luxury cars and vacation homes, and a lifestyle that looked successful enough to attract even more victims. When it collapsed in 1997, more than 400 people lost their retirement savings. Some lost everything. The FBI had worked the case for months, following paper trails and shell companies. But the key witness, the person whose testimony had been the cornerstone of the prosecution, was a forensic accountant who'd untangled Strauss's web of deception and laid it bare for the jury. His name was Gerald Hayes, my father. I sat back from the laptop, my mind reeling. I'd been young when Dad worked that case, maybe 12 or 13. I remembered him being gone a lot, remembered Mom saying he was working on something important. He'd gotten an award from the state, a commendation for his role in bringing down a major fraud operation. We'd gone to a ceremony at the courthouse, and Dad had given a speech about justice and protecting the vulnerable. I'd been so proud of him. Now I pulled up more articles searching for mentions of Richard Strauss's family. I found a photograph from the trial, a grainy courtroom sketch that had run in the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Richard Strauss at the defense table, his expensive suit unable to hide the defeat in his posture. And behind him in the gallery, a teenage boy with dark hair and hollow eyes staring at the witness stand with an expression of pure, burning hatred. The caption identified him as Michael Strauss, the defendant's 15-year-old son. I looked at that boy's face and tried to see Martin in it. The bone structure was the same, the shape of the jaw, the way his eyebrows drew together. 27 years had passed between that photograph and the man I'd married, but the connection was undeniable. Martin Cole was Michael Strauss. Miriam found the rest of the story through public records. After Richard Strauss hanged himself in prison in 1998, his wife Barbara had legally changed her name back to her maiden name Cole. She'd changed her son's name too, giving him a fresh start, a clean slate. Michael Strauss became Martin Cole, and they moved to a different city, tried to rebuild their shattered lives, but Michael had never forgotten. He'd never forgiven. The FBI confirmed it all with fingerprints lifted from Martin's office. They matched juvenile records from Michael Strauss's brief encounter with the law in 1999, a shoplifting charge that had been expunged when he turned 18. Agent Morrison called me personally to deliver the news, her voice professional, but tinged with something that might have been sympathy. "Your husband's real name is Michael Richard Strauss," she said. "He's been using the identity Martin Cole for 25 years. We're bringing him in for questioning." They let me watch through the two-way mirror when they interrogated him. Martin sat at the metal table in the small gray room, his hands folded, his face expressionless. He'd lawyered up immediately, but his attorney had stepped out to take a call, and in that brief window, Agent Morrison did something unexpected. She brought me into the room. Martin looked up when I entered, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw genuine surprise cross his face. I walked to the table and slid the newspaper photograph across to him, the one of 15-year-old Michael Strauss staring at my father with hatred in his eyes. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at me, and he smiled. It wasn't the charming smile he'd used to court me, or the cold smile I'd seen in his office. This was something else, something that looked almost like relief. "You figured it out," he said. "Good. I was tired of pretending I loved you, Eleanor." My hands were steady on the table between us. "My father destroyed your family." "Your father," Martin said, and now his voice had an edge to it. "Destroyed my father." Stood up in that courtroom and testified for 3 days about fraud and victims and justice. He was the hero. We were the villains. My mother couldn't find work. We lost our house. Kids at school called me the thief's son. And then Dad killed himself, and we had nothing. Not even our name. "So you decided to do to me what happened to you." "I decided," Martin said slowly, "to return the favor. Your father took everything from my family. I wanted to take everything from his, starting with his daughter, and I almost did." Agent Morrison stepped forward, but I held up my hand. I needed to finish this. "Almost," I said. "But you failed. And now everyone will know exactly who you are. Not Martin Cole, respected financial advisor. Michael Strauss, son of a fraud who became exactly what his father was." For the first time, Martin's smile faded. His eyes went dark, and I saw something flicker across his face that might have been fear or might have been shame. "You're just like him," I said quietly. "Your father destroyed people's lives for money. You destroyed them for revenge. But the result is the same, and the ending will be the same too." I walked out of that interrogation room with my head high, leaving Martin sitting alone with the ghost of his father and the ruins of his elaborate decades-long revenge plot. This wasn't a con. This was a blood feud disguised as a marriage. And I'd just won. I'd been home from the FBI interrogation for less than an hour when my phone rang. Jenna's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. We hadn't spoken since that night she'd come to my house with her scripted accusations, since I'd seen Martin's text telling her to stick to her lines. But something made me pick up. "Ellie." Her voice was raw, barely above a whisper. "Please, I need to see you. I need to tell you everything." We agreed to meet at an all-night diner 40 minutes outside Maple Grove, the kind of anonymous place where nobody would recognize us or care about our business. I arrived first, choosing a booth in the back corner, ordering coffee I had no intention of drinking. When Jenna walked through the door 20 minutes later, I barely recognized her. My sister looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair hung limp around her face, her eyes were swollen and red-rimmed, and she'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. She slid into the booth across from me and didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I knew Ellie," she said, the words tumbling out like she'd been holding them back too long. "Not at first. At first I really believed he loved me, that we had something real. But I knew. Eventually, I knew." I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup and waited. This was her confession, her moment. I wasn't going to make it easier. "He paid off my medical debt," Jenna continued, staring at her hands. $80,000 just like that. I thought it was generosity, thought he was helping me because he cared. But then he started asking questions. Casual at first. "What time did you go to the library? Did you keep financial records at home? What had Mom left you in her will?" I told myself he was just being thorough, that he was a financial advisor, and these questions were natural. She looked up at me then, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before, shame so deep it had hollowed her out. Then I found the files in his car. I was looking for a phone charger, and I opened the glove compartment, and there was this folder. Profiles of women I'd never heard of. Insurance documents. Handwritten notes about target timelines and acquisition strategies. Your name was on one of the pages, Ellie, with dates, with plans. I realized I wasn't helping a jealous husband. I was helping a predator hunt my own sister. My throat felt tight, but I kept my voice level. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was terrified," Jenna said, and now tears were streaming down her face. "He had leverage. He recorded us together, told me if I ever spoke out, he'd release the videos and destroy whatever reputation I had left. And the money, God, the money. He made it clear he could take it all back, report me to collections, ruin me financially. I was trapped. Every day I wanted to warn you, and every day I was too much of a coward to do it." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small USB drive, setting it on the table between us like an offering. "But I recorded him too," she said. "Every conversation I could, especially after I found those files. He talked about his plans about the other women, about how the insurance policies worked. He never suspected I was documenting everything. It's all here. Everything you need." I picked up the drive, turning it over in my fingers. It was such a small thing to hold so much weight. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Jenna said, her voice breaking. "I don't deserve that. I'm asking you to let me fix this, to let me help take him down. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything. I'll do whatever it takes." The diner was quiet around us, just the soft clink of dishes and the murmur of late-night conversations. I thought about my mother, about how she'd always said family was complicated, that loving someone meant seeing their worst and choosing them anyway. I thought about the little girl Jenna had been before debt and desperation, and Martin's manipulation had twisted her into someone I didn't recognize. "You hurt me," I said finally. "You let him use you. You were in my house sitting on my couch lying to my face." "I know." "But you're here now," I continued. "You're sitting in this diner at midnight with evidence that could send you to prison as an accessory. That's what matters." Jenna's shoulders shook with sobs, and this time I reached across the table and took her hand. We didn't embrace, didn't fall into easy forgiveness. The scars between us were too fresh, too deep. But there was an understanding, a bridge being built from the rubble of what Martin had destroyed. "Miriam will need to talk to you," I said. "The FBI too. You'll have to testify formally, probably multiple times. It won't be easy." "I know," Jenna said again. "I'll do it. I'll tell them everything." We sat there for another hour drinking bad coffee and talking in quiet voices about what came next. When we finally left, walking out into the dark parking lot, I stopped and turned to my sister. "When you testify," I said, "when you give your statement and they ask your name for the record, use our last name, not his." Jenna looked at me, and for the first time in months, I saw something like strength in her eyes. "I will," she said. "I'm Jenna Hayes, not Cole, never Cole." We drove home separately, two sisters who'd been broken and were slowly, painfully being put back together. The USB drive sat in my purse, another piece of evidence in the growing mountain that would bury Martin. When she said Hayes instead of Cole, I knew we'd won. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning while I was making breakfast. My phone chimed with a new message from an address I didn't recognize, just a random string of numbers and letters. No subject line. Something about it made my skin crawl even before I opened it. The email contained a single video file. I pressed play and watched grainy surveillance footage unfold on my screen. Jenna leaving her apartment building, locking the door behind her. Jenna walking to her car in the parking lot. Jenna at the grocery store pushing a cart down the produce aisle. The footage was recent, maybe from yesterday, shot from different angles, like someone had been following her with a phone camera. There was no message, no explanation. The threat was clear without words. An hour later, a second email arrived from the same address. This one had text, "Drop the case or your sister has an accident." My hands were shaking as I forwarded both emails to Agent Morrison and called Miriam. This wasn't about money anymore, or even justice. Martin was threatening Jenna's life, and we both knew he was capable of following through. He'd already killed my mother. He'd destroyed countless other women. One more victim wouldn't trouble his conscience. Agent Morrison called me back within 20 minutes. "We're taking this seriously, Mrs. Hayes. This is felony blackmail and a credible threat of violence. We're tracing the emails now." The FBI's cyber team worked through the afternoon while I sat in my living room with Jenna, who'd come over as soon as I called her. She was pale but remarkably calm, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. "I'm not dropping anything," she said. "When I suggested maybe we should back off, let Martin take a plea deal, anything to keep her safe. He's counted on women being too scared to fight back. I'm done being scared." By evening, Caleb had worked his tech contacts and narrowed the IP address origin to a 40-mile radius. Then, through a combination of cell tower data and credit card transactions, they pinpointed a location, the Riverside Motel, a rundown place off Highway 33, where rooms rented by the week and nobody asked questions. The raid happened just after midnight. Agent Morrison called me from the scene, and I could hear voices shouting in the background, the controlled chaos of law enforcement executing a warrant. "We've got him," she said. They found Martin in room 17, and what they found with him painted a picture more terrifying than I'd imagined. There was a duffel bag packed with clothes, $10,000 in cash, and 3 fake IDs with Martin's photo, but different names. A burner phone contained draft messages he'd never sent, more threats, more surveillance details. But the worst discovery was a small black case hidden under the bathroom sink. Inside were medical supplies, syringes still in their sterile packaging, 3 vials of insulin, latex gloves, and a handwritten list on yellow legal paper. The list had names and addresses, my daily schedule, including when I left for work and when I returned home, Jenna's apartment number, and the fact that she left her bedroom window cracked at night. Ruth Morrison's hospice facility with notes about visiting hours and which entrance had the least security. Agent Morrison's voice was grim when she described it to me over the phone. "Mrs. Hayes, he wasn't planning to run. He was planning to eliminate witnesses. Insulin in a non-diabetic can cause fatal hypoglycemia that looks like natural causes, especially in elderly or sick patients. If we hadn't found him tonight, if he'd gotten to Ruth or your sister—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They arrested Martin on the spot. Blackmail, stalking, conspiracy to commit murder. The charges were federal now, not just state. He'd crossed too many lines, threatened too many people, planned too methodically for this to be anything less than premeditated violence. I watched the news coverage the next morning, footage of Martin being led out of that motel in handcuffs, his face blank and empty. The polished financial advisor was gone. What remained was Michael Strauss, son of a con man who'd spent 27 years planning his revenge and had finally been stopped. But as I watched that footage, something crystallized inside me. This wasn't just about Martin and me anymore. It wasn't even just about the 15 other women whose names appeared in his insurance files. This was about every woman who'd ever been targeted by men like him, every family destroyed by people who saw human lives as profit opportunities. Ruth was in hospice fighting to stay alive long enough to see justice done. Miriam's sister had died, believing she was worthless, that losing everything was somehow her fault. My mother had been murdered, trying to protect me. These women deserved more than Martin getting arrested. They deserved the world to know what he'd done, deserved their names cleared and their stories told. I called Miriam that afternoon, my decision made. "We're not settling," I said. "I don't care what kind of plea deal his lawyers offer. We're taking this to trial. I want every detail exposed. I want the media there. I want everyone to know exactly who Martin Cole really is and what he did to us." Miriam was quiet for a moment. Then her voice came through, strong and certain. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll make sure his name becomes synonymous with everything he tried to hide." I hung up and looked at the photograph I'd found all those weeks ago, the one with "Next E. Hayes" written on the back. Martin had made me a target, had planned my destruction with the same cold calculation he'd used on 15 other women. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd assumed I'd be easy to break, easy to silence, easy to erase. He didn't come to that motel to run. He came to finish what he started. And instead, we finished him. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in late October, and the courtroom was packed an hour before proceedings began. I sat in the front row with Miriam, watching reporters jostle for position, watching other women file in quietly, women whose faces I recognized from Miriam's folder of victims. Martin entered flanked by 2 expensive lawyers in tailored suits, and he looked exactly like what he'd always pretended to be successful, composed, slightly annoyed by the inconvenience of it all. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and when he sat at the defense table, he barely glanced at the gallery behind him. Then Ruth Morrison was wheeled into the courtroom. The bailiff held the door as a hospice nurse pushed Ruth's wheelchair down the center aisle. An oxygen tank hung from the back of the chair, clear tubing running to Ruth's nose, and she looked impossibly small in her best dress, the fabric hanging loose on her wasted frame. But when she looked up at the judge and was sworn in, her voice carried through the courtroom with perfect clarity. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Linda Chen, walked Ruth through her testimony with gentle precision. How Ruth had met Martin 6 years ago, how he'd promised to help her pension stretch through retirement, how $400,000 had vanished into thin air while Martin explained it away as market volatility and bad timing. Ruth's voice never wavered, even when she described having to choose between medications and groceries, between heating her home and paying her medical bills. Then Prosecutor Chen said the words that changed everything. "Mrs. Morrison, do you have any other evidence regarding Mr. Cole's character and intentions?" Ruth nodded slowly. "I do. I have a recording." Martin's lead attorney shot to his feet, objecting before the recording even started, but Judge Harrison overruled him with a sharp look. The courtroom fell silent as Chen pressed play on the digital recorder Ruth had kept safe for all these years. Martin's voice filled the space, younger sounding but unmistakable. "Ruth, can I ask you something? Hypothetically, of course. You used to investigate insurance claims, right? Accidental deaths, that sort of thing. So hypothetically, if someone wanted to make a death look accidental, what would you look for?" The recording played for 3 minutes, Martin's casual tone asking detailed questions about medication, interactions, about how investigators determined natural death from suspicious circumstances, about what mistakes people made when trying to stage accidents. When it ended, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Ruth turned in her wheelchair to look directly at Martin. Her oxygen hissed softly, the only sound in the room. "You asked me how to kill someone and make it look natural," she said, her voice clear and strong. I have the proof. And I have cancer, Mr. Cole. What do you have? Martin's carefully maintained composure cracked. His face went pale, his eyes shifted away from Ruth's steady gaze, and his lawyer leaned in urgently whispering words I couldn't hear. But I saw Martin shake his head, saw something like fear cross his features for the first time since this all began. 3 days later, Ruth passed away peacefully in hospice. I was there holding her hand when she took her last breath. Just before the end, she'd squeezed my fingers and whispered, "I saw him in chains. I can rest now." Her funeral drew dozens of women. Martin had touched women who stood together in the church cemetery as silent witnesses to what he'd done and what Ruth had helped stop. I delivered the eulogy with a steady voice looking out at their faces. Ruth didn't live to see the trial end, I said, but she lived to see him fall. That's justice. She kept her promise, and I swore I'd keep mine. The trial began 4 months after Ruth's death on a cold February morning when snow was falling soft and quiet outside the courthouse windows. Martin arrived each day in perfectly tailored suits, his hair neat, his expressions somber and controlled. His defense team had crafted a careful narrative. Yes, Martin had made mistakes in his personal life. Yes, he'd had an affair. Yes, some of his financial advice hadn't worked out as planned. But none of that made him a murderer. They painted him as a man with a troubled childhood, abandoned by a father who'd destroyed the family name, trying to build something better, and stumbling along the way. When Martin took the stand in his own defense, he spoke softly about losing his father to suicide, about the shame that had followed him, about wanting to help people the way no one had helped his family. He even cried, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief, and I watched 2 jurors lean forward sympathetically. I sat in the gallery with my hands clenched in my lap, watching him perform, knowing exactly what he was doing because I'd lived with this man for 3 years. I'd seen him turn charm on and off like a switch, seen him calculate exactly what emotion each situation required. Then Miriam stood up for the prosecution's rebuttal, and everything changed. She spread my mother's medical records across a projection screen for the jury to see, walking them through the timeline with surgical precision. Mom's steady improvement in the first week, then the sudden cascade of complications. Miriam called the forensic toxicologist Dr. Patel, who explained in clear, careful terms how digoxin toxicity would present arrhythmia, confusion, cardiac arrest. The hospital pharmacy confirmed digoxin had been prescribed for my mother's pre-existing heart condition, a medication she'd taken safely for years. Then Miriam displayed the visitor log, Martin's name appearing 3 times, and showed the jury the correlation, each visit followed by a rapid decline in my mother's condition. The courtroom was silent, except for Miriam's voice, steady and relentless, building the case piece by piece. But the moment that broke, Martin came when Miriam introduced Dr. Raymond Holt's sealed statement. The attending physician had died 2 years earlier of a heart attack, but he'd left a confession with his attorney to be opened only if an investigation into patient deaths ever occurred. The prosecutor read it aloud, and Dr. Holt's guilt echoed through the courtroom. A man identifying himself as Eleanor Hayes's future son-in-law offered me $50,000 to adjust medication dosages for patient Margaret Hayes. I was drowning in debt from a failed investment. God forgive me, I accepted. Martin exploded out of his chair before his lawyers could stop him. She was going to stop everything, he shouted, his face twisted with rage. She knew I wasn't who I said I was. She kept asking questions, kept digging. I didn't have a choice. His lawyers grabbed his arms, trying to pull him back down, but Martin was beyond control now, all his careful composure shattered. You think you've won, Ellie? He turned to stare at me, and his eyes were wild. You think this ends it? I'll be out in 10 years and I'll find you. I'll finish what I started. Judge Harrison's gavel came down like thunder. Mr. Cole, sit down immediately or you will be removed from this courtroom. But it was too late. The jury had seen behind the mask, seen the predator. Martin had always been the cold calculation that had driven him to kill my mother and target 15 other women. His lawyers finally wrestled him back into his seat, but the damage was complete and irreversible. I sat perfectly still through all of it, my hands folded in my lap, my face calm. I didn't react to his threats or his rage. I didn't need to. The jury had heard everything they needed to hear, seen everything they needed to see. 3 days later, they returned a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge gave him 25 years without possibility of parole. But I gave him something worse: irrelevance. 6 months after Martin's sentencing, I stood in front of the federal courthouse where he'd been convicted and watched workers hang a banner across the entrance, the Ruth Hayes Foundation for Financial Justice. The irony of the location wasn't lost on me. This building had witnessed Martin's downfall, and now it would house an organization dedicated to making sure what happened to us never happened to anyone else. The government had seized Martin's assets as proceeds of crime, millions of dollars stolen from vulnerable women over decades. His lawyers tried to fight it, but the evidence was overwhelming. I could have claimed a portion for myself, compensation for what he'd taken. Instead, I donated every penny I was owed to establish the foundation. Money built on lies and death had no place in my life, but it could be transformed into something that saved lives. Jenna became our director of outreach. She'd spent the months since the trial in therapy, working through her guilt and trauma. And when she came to me with the idea of using her story to help other women I knew, she'd found her path forward. She spoke at support groups and senior centers, standing in front of rooms full of women and saying the words she'd needed to hear years ago. If someone pays off your debts and then asks you to keep secrets, you're not being helped. You're being controlled. Evelyn Sharp called me the day after the verdict. Her voice was strong, despite her 82 years, and her words were direct. I want to fund this fight. $5 million to start. More if you need it. She joined our board as senior advisor, bringing decades of investment wisdom and a Rolodex of contacts that opened doors I didn't even know existed. When people asked why she was so generous, Evelyn's answer was always the same. Because 20 years ago, I had the resources to fight back, and I didn't. These women deserve better. Louise Harper developed our educational programs, creating workshops for high schools and senior centers about recognizing financial manipulation and romantic fraud. She had a teacher's gift for making complex concepts accessible, for explaining red flags in ways that didn't feel preachy or condescending. Within 3 months, she was booking presentations, 6 weeks out traveling to communities across Ohio and neighboring states. Miriam ran our legal division, coordinating with a network of volunteer attorneys who provided free consultations to women who suspected they were being scammed. Caleb headed our forensic accounting team, training other accountants to spot the patterns Martin had used, the subtle ways money got diverted and hidden and stolen. In our first 6 months, we helped 47 women. Some cases were straightforward, others complex, but each one mattered. We recovered a combined $2.3 million money that went back to the women who'd earned it, who'd trusted the wrong person and paid the price. The official launch event was held on a Saturday in September, exactly 1 year after I'd walked into Martin's office and found him with Jenna. The courthouse steps were decorated with flowers and folding chairs stretched across the plaza for the 200 people who'd RSVP'd. Media cameras lined the back row, and I recognized faces from the trial scattered throughout the crowd. I stood at the podium and looked out at these women survivors, fighters, witnesses to what happened when predators went unchecked. My prepared speech sat in front of me, but the words I needed came from somewhere deeper. My mother died trying to protect me, I said, and my voice carried across the plaza without wavering. Ruth Morrison died after protecting all of us. This foundation is their legacy, not mine. We don't want revenge. We want prevention. We want to make sure no woman ever has to sit in a courtroom and hear a man say he had no choice, when the truth is he chose cruelty every single time. The applause started before I finished building until it echoed off the courthouse walls. I saw women crying, others nodding, all of them understanding what this meant. We weren't just victims who'd survived. We were an army that had won. After the ceremony, as people mingled and volunteers handed out information packets, a young woman approached me hesitantly. She was maybe 35, professionally dressed, with an engagement ring glinting on her left hand. Ms. Hayes. Her voice was soft, uncertain. My name is Rebecca Chen. I saw your story on the news and I need to ask you something. My boyfriend just proposed and I'm happy, but there's this feeling I can't shake. He keeps asking about my parents' estate, about my inheritance. He says it's just financial planning, but something feels wrong. Can you help me check his background? I looked over at Miriam, who'd been watching from a few feet away. She caught my eye and nodded, already pulling out her phone to start making notes. I turned back to Rebecca and felt something settle into place inside me, a sense of purpose that had been building through all the months of investigation and trial and testimony. That's exactly why we're here, I said, guiding her toward Miriam. Let's talk. As Rebecca walked away with Miriam toward our temporary office, I stood on those courthouse steps and realized something profound. I didn't become a victim who survived. I became a protector who remembered. I didn't become a victim who survived. I became a protector who remembered. 1 year after the Foundation's launch, I knelt in my garden on a bright April morning pressing zinnia seeds into the dark soil. The packet said they were known for their endurance for blooming even in poor conditions, and something about that appealed to me. I'd sold the house I'd shared with Martin 6 months after his sentencing, couldn't bear to stay in a place where every room held memories of lies. The small cottage I bought sat on the edge of town surrounded by oak trees and quiet with a garden plot that got full sun most of the day. It was mine, truly mine, with no ghosts lingering in the corners. Jenna came by most Sundays now bringing apple pies made from Mom's recipe, the one we'd thought was lost, until we found it in an old cookbook tucked in a kitchen drawer. We'd sit at my small table and eat pie and talk about the Foundation, about the women we'd helped that week, about anything except Martin. He existed somewhere in a federal prison, his appeals denied his name, now synonymous with exactly the kind of predator he'd always been. We didn't need to talk about him anymore. He'd become what he deserved to be, irrelevant. I slept through most nights now, waking only occasionally from dreams that faded quickly in the morning light. The Foundation kept me busy in the best possible way, each case a reminder of why this work mattered, each woman we helped a small victory against men like Martin. Miriam's car pulled into my driveway around 10, and she got out carrying 2 cups of coffee from the place downtown that knew exactly how we both liked it. We sat on my porch in the wooden rockers I'd bought at an estate sale, watching the garden and the oak trees beyond it. The FBI identified 3 more, Miriam said after a comfortable silence. Men using the same playbook as Martin, targeting widows and divorcees, love-bombing them, getting access to their finances. 1 in Arizona, 1 in Florida, 1 in upstate New York. I took a sip of coffee and thought about those women, thought about how close I'd come to being another obituary in Martin's collection. They want you to consult on a national task force, Miriam continued. Elder Financial Crimes Unit. You'd be working with FBI agents, helping them understand the psychology, the patterns, how these men operate. You'd be perfect for it. Would I have to travel? Probably. Maybe once or twice a month. They'd fly you to wherever the investigations are active. I looked at my garden at the tiny green shoots already pushing through the soil where I'd planted the zinnia seeds just 2 weeks ago. Life insisting on itself despite everything. Let me think about it, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew I'd already decided. There was more work to do, more women to protect, more predators to stop. That evening, as the sun was setting and painting my garden gold, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a Washington area code. Ms. Hayes, this is Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's Elder Financial Crimes Unit. I apologize for calling so late, but we have a situation developing in Michigan. A financial advisor, same pattern as your case 15, confirmed victims, possibly more. We need someone who understands how these men think, how they operate. Would you be willing to consult? I walked to the window and looked out at my garden. The zinnias were just beginning to show color, tough little blooms that would keep flowering until the first frost. I thought about Ruth, who'd given her last days to stop Martin. I thought about my mother, who'd tried to protect me and paid with her life. I thought about Rebecca and all the women who'd walked through the Foundation's doors, scared and ashamed and desperate for someone to believe them. I thought about how I was 59 years old now, gray-haired and stronger than I'd ever been, no longer waiting for someone else to deliver justice. "I have all the time in the world," I said. After I hung up, I stood in my garden as dusk settled around me, phone still in my hand, zinnia petals catching the last golden light. The foundation would continue its work. Jenna and Miriam and Evelyn and Louise would keep helping women in Ohio. But there was a bigger fight now, a national network of predators who thought they could operate in shadows, who counted on women being too ashamed or too scared to fight back. They were wrong. Someone once asked me if I'd forgiven Martin. I said no, and I meant it. Forgiveness is for people who deserve a second chance, who've shown remorse, who've earned redemption through change and accountability. Justice is for people who don't. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Agent Chen again. There's another advisor targeting widows in Grand Rapids. Can you help?" I smiled, looking at my garden where zinnias would soon bloom in defiant color, where life continued despite poor soil and harsh conditions, where endurance meant everything. Some gardens grow best when tended by those who've weathered the worst storms. I typed back a single word, yes. That's my story. The story of how I walked into an office with homemade sandwiches and walked out with a mission that changed my life and saved countless others. Martin Cole thought he could destroy me the way his father's crimes had destroyed him. He thought revenge was a straight line from his pain to mine. But he was wrong about something fundamental. Hurt people don't have to hurt people. We can choose differently. We can choose to protect instead of destroy, to build instead of tear down, to turn our worst experiences into someone else's salvation. Today, the Ruth Hayes Foundation continues to grow. We've helped over 500 women across 18 states recover more than $8 million stolen by financial predators. Jenna runs our outreach program with a passion that comes from understanding both sides of manipulation. Miriam leads our legal team with the fierce dedication of someone who lost a sister and refuses to lose anyone else. And I consult with the FBI, helping identify patterns and protect vulnerable women before they become statistics. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people in your life or the instincts you've been ignoring, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might change your perspective or even save your life. More importantly, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your mother, your sister, your friend who's been dating someone who asks too many questions about money. Sometimes the story is the warning someone needs. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had that gut feeling that something was wrong in a relationship, but you ignored it because you wanted to believe the best in someone? What finally made you listen to your instincts? And for those of you who've survived financial abuse or romantic fraud, what advice would you give to someone who's just starting to suspect they're being targeted? Your experience could be exactly what saves someone else. The comments section isn't just for discussion. It's a community of survivors and protectors, and your voice matters here. Remember what Ruth taught me. Zinnias bloom even in poor soil. You're stronger than you think, braver than you know, and you deserve people in your life who see your value instead of your vulnerabilities. Trust your instincts. They're usually right. And if you're in danger right now, if someone is isolating you or controlling your finances or making you question your own judgment, reach out. Call the National Domestic Violence Hotline, contact your local FBI field office, or visit our foundation's website. There are people ready to help people who've been exactly where you are and made it through to the other side. Thank you for listening to my story. Now go protect yours.